Cenote Temple of Doom Cave Incident. On August 17, 1997, Eduardo Mendez prepared for a diving trip with 5 tourists in Mexico. The tourists were 3 Americans and 2 Canadians. Eduardo was 28 years old and worked as an open water diving instructor for 3 years. By early afternoon, the group arrived at Cenote Temple of Doom. Temple of Doom was a small, dark hole in the jungle floor about 10 feet across. A wooden ladder went down 16 feet to the water surface. Rebecca Williams was a 34-year-old nurse with her husband Mark. Thomas Chen was a 42-year-old software engineer. His wife Lisa is 30-year-old. Joy Johnson was a 28-year-old teacher. Joy decided to sit out this dive because she was tired. They had single tanks, minimal lighting, and lacked proper cave diving equipment. Eduardo gave a briefing that emphasized the beauty but didn't focus on the risks. One by one, they entered the water. The cenote surface was small and surrounded by limestone walls. Sunlight barely reached into the water, creating a mysterious atmosphere. They checked their equipment and went underwater. At about 33 feet, they passed through a boundary where fresh water meets salt water. Beyond this, the cavern opened into a larger chamber. For 20 minutes, the group explored the cavern zone within sight of natural light. Then, Eduardo made a fateful decision. Rather than staying in the safe area, he led them toward a passage called the Madonna Passage. 2 warning signs marked the boundary between the cavern and the true cave zone. The first sign showed a diver with a red slash through it. The second sign said, "Stop! Prevent your death. Go no further." Eduardo swam past these warnings without stopping. His clients, trusting his judgment, followed. The Madonna Passage narrowed to about 5 feet wide and 6.5 feet high. As they went forward, the light from the entrance vanished. After 10 minutes in the passage, they were about 394 feet from the entrance. Their single tanks were running low due to depth, effort, and anxiety. Thomas Chen was the first to signal a problem with his air supply. Eduardo finally recognized the danger and signaled for the group to turn back. In the narrow passage, turning around with 5 divers created confusion. Their movement disturbed silt from the cave floor. Eduardo headed toward the exit, assuming the group was following. Rebecca and Mark Williams became separated in the sudden darkness. Thomas and Lisa Chen, staying together but equally lost, moved in another direction. When Eduardo reached the cavern zone, he realized only he had emerged from the passage. His tank was approaching empty levels. He surfaced quickly and explained the situation to Joy. Eduardo swapped his nearly empty tank for Joy's full one. Without waiting for help, he went back into the water. About 295 feet in, he found Lisa Chen with her regulator out of her mouth. Thomas's air gauge showed near empty. Eduardo immediately shared his air with Lisa and began guiding them out. Thomas followed them. Upon reaching the cavern zone, Eduardo sent the Chens to the surface. Eduardo immediately returned to search for the Williams couple. 50 feet into the passage, he found Rebecca Williams unconscious with an empty tank. He grabbed her and brought her to the surface. Eduardo continued his search and found Mark Williams. Mark was floating motionless with an empty tank. There was nothing Eduardo could do for him. Emergency services arrived and Rebecca Williams was taken to the hospital. Despite medical care, Rebecca died later that evening from drowning and oxygen loss. Fault Cave Incident. On March 21, 1996, Randy, Sam, and Eric set out for a day of caving adventure. It was Eric's first ever caving trip. Fault Cave near Denver was known for its dangerous passages. Part of the cave was nicknamed the Crack of Doom, a narrow slot that had trapped many people before. They had little more than torches and basic gear. Randy had done a few caving trips before, but for Eric, this was completely new. They walked through the forest towards the cave entrance. The group squeezed through jagged rocks and narrow passages. As they moved deeper, the tight passages became more confining with every crawl. The cave walls pressed in on all sides, but Eric kept going. Then they reached the Crack of Doom, a narrow slot in the cave. Eric attempted to squeeze through, but his body slipped into a head-down position. With each movement, he became more stuck. All the pressure was coming toward his neck and head. Sam and Randy tried desperately to pull him out, but Eric's position, head down and wedged tight, made it impossible. Each deep breath made him feel like his heart would stop. His companions knew they couldn't free him on their own. Randy quickly scrambled out of the cave to get help. Randy used his cell phone to call a local caver, Jim Neely. Jim quickly organized a rescue team. The situation was serious. Eric had been stuck for hours and his strength was fading. The rescue was a slow, careful process. They inspected the Crack of Doom and realized drilling could make debris fall on Eric's head. They went for a different option. First, they took off Eric's clothes to reduce friction against the rock. Then they coated his entire body with Vaseline to help him slide free. The cavers worked quietly, knowing that every second counted. The cold, damp air of the cave made hypothermia a real threat. The position Eric was trapped in made his situation very dangerous. As they applied the Vaseline, they noticed his body starting to shift slightly. This gave them hope. They continued coating every inch of his body. With each application, Eric's body became more able to move. Finally, with one last effort, the team was able to free him. They slid him smoothly out from the crack of doom. Eric was able to walk out of the cave with help from the team. Schetromph Cave Incident. On January 24, 2011, 4 young adults decided to explore Schetromph Cave. There were 2 men and 2 women in the group. They wanted to see if the cave would be good for future club trips. They entered the cave around 2:30 p.m. The exploration went well until they started to exit. One of the young men faced a very tight and challenging section of the cave. To get out, he had to go head first through a narrow, hourglass-shaped passage. This passage made a sharp 90-degree turn before getting even narrower. His female companions went through carefully, and he followed. He approached the narrow passage on his hands and knees. As he lowered himself into the pit head first, he misjudged his grip. His leg folded against his chest in a painful position. The rock walls pinched around him, trapping him at the tightest part. He was completely upside down with his head on the cold, hard ground. Panic set in quickly. His female companions tried to pull him free but couldn't. They tried to lift him, but their strength wasn't enough. After 20 minutes, they realized they needed help. One of them scrambled out of the cave and called 911. The young man's leg was twisted painfully against his body. Blood pooled and rushed to his skull, creating unbearable pressure. His vision became blurry and his thoughts became confused. A local resident heard the emergency call and contacted his friend Jerry Bowen. Jerry was an experienced caver. Jerry and his son Stephen quickly drove to the site. Stephen was smaller, so he was chosen to go in. One of the women volunteered to guide Stephen back into the cave. When Stephen finally reached the trapped cavern, they were face to face. Stephen began chiseling away at the rock. His heart was pounding as he tried not to injure the trapped man. The work was slow and nerve-wracking. The trapped man had slipped further down, making it harder to reach the rock. With the man's friend pulling from above and Stephen pushing from below, they got him into a slightly better position. Stephen resumed chiseling, carefully removing the final rock. With a collective push and pull, the man's leg finally popped free. At 10 p.m., nearly 8 hours after the ordeal began, the rescued man finally emerged into the night air. He was flown to a hospital for evaluation. Miraculously, he had no serious injuries. Culverson Creek Cave Incident. On November 28, 1985, 7 friends who loved exploring caves went to Culverson Creek Cave in West Virginia. There had been a lot of rain recently, which caused flooding in the area. When they entered the cave, they found a passage that was 5 to 8 feet wide. A shallow stream flowed quickly over loose rocks on the cave floor. The group walked forward, not knowing what was about to happen. Only about 50 feet into the cave, they came to a huge boulder, a 5-foot-tall rock that was blocking part of the passage. The group had 2 ways to get past it: climb over the boulder or squeeze through a narrow gap between the rock and the cave floor where the stream was flowing. 3 cavers went through the tight space safely without any problems. Eric Slagle, who was 26 years old and had lots of caving experience, led the next group of 3 people. He chose to go through the left side, stepping carefully as he walked through the stream. Just as he reached the middle of the boulder, something terrible happened. Suddenly, the massive boulder shifted and began to tilt to the left. The rock became unstable and started to fall. The other cavers tried quickly to stop it from moving, but they couldn't. The huge boulder crashed down, trapping Eric between the cave wall and the rock. Eric was stuck completely. His left temple and shoulder were pressed against the cave wall, and his right cheek was trapped against the boulder. His body couldn't move at all. The weight of the rock pressed hard against his chest, making it very difficult for him to breathe. Eric's friends were shocked and scared. They could see the pain in his eyes and watched as he got weaker. The feeling of not being able to help was terrible for them. One person ran out of the cave to get help, while the others stayed and desperately tried to move the boulder. They pushed with all their strength, trying as hard as they could, but it didn't work. The rock was too heavy. They tried to use crowbars to move the rock, pulling with every bit of strength they had, but nothing worked. While they tried, they watched Eric's breathing get weaker and weaker. Eric stayed awake for about 3 minutes after the boulder fell. Soon his body stopped moving. A small amount of blood came from his nose and his pulse was getting weaker. One of the cavers tried to hold him up, hoping to take some pressure off him, but it didn't help much. At 4:20 in the afternoon, nearly an hour after the accident, they finally had a hydraulic jack. With a team of rescuers, crowbars, and the jack, they managed to move the boulder just enough to free Eric's body. His friends carried him to a drier part of the cave, just 20 feet away, and immediately started CPR. With every chest compression and every breath they tried to give him, they hoped they could bring him back. But Eric wasn't responding. His skin had turned pale, and although his body was still warm, his life was slipping away. At 5:25 in the evening, Eric was finally carried out of the cave on a stretcher. He was rushed to the hospital. Despite everyone's best efforts, it was too late. Eric Slagle died from his injuries. Ice Rink Cave Incident. On May 25, 2003, Chris Molyneux planned a cave trip. Chris was 36 years old and had explored caves before. He wanted to take his family to Ice Rink Cave in Washington. Chris brought his wife Michelle and their 3 children. They drove to the mountains in their car. Chris parked the car about 200 yards from the cave entrance. They found a dark opening in the ground. Chris was not sure if this was the right entrance to Ice Rink Cave. He decided to go inside alone first to check if it was safe. The cave entrance got smaller as he went deeper underground. After 100 feet, Chris found a tiny crawlway that was only 18 inches high. He looked at his cave map with his headlamp. Chris thought the crawlway would lead to the main part of the cave. He crawled through the tight space. When he came out, he was in a bigger passage. Chris started walking. He walked for a long time but could not find the main part. Chris found rocks that had fallen from the ceiling. This was not shown on his map. He climbed over the rocks and kept walking. Chris couldn't find the main part. He decided to go back. Chris turned around and walked back the way he came. Finally, Chris reached what looked like the crawlway, but it was completely blocked with dirt and rocks. Chris realized he was lost. Chris turned back and walked the way he came. He walked for a long time again. Then he found another blocked entrance that looked exactly the same. This confused Chris because there should only be one blocked entrance. To test something, Chris made a big X in the dirt. He walked in the opposite direction and counted his steps. After 400 steps, his headlamp showed the same X in the dirt. Chris realized he was trapped in a circle. The cave passage went in a loop with no way out. Chris walked around the loop many times. He had been underground for over an hour. He tore pieces of his map and left them at different spots. This helped him know where he had already looked. After 5 hours, Chris was getting very scared. He was tired, thirsty, and could not think clearly. Chris started to panic. Chris thought about his children waiting outside. This gave him strength to keep trying. Chris went back to the blocked entrance and searched again. This time he stayed very close to the wall. He looked at every inch of the wall. 50 feet from the blocked entrance, Chris saw something different. There it was, the crawlway. It was hidden behind a rock and very hard to see. Chris had walked past it many times without noticing. He crawled through the opening as fast as he could. A few minutes later, Chris came out into the sunlight. Chris had been underground for 6 hours. Killiansburg Cave Incident. In June 1992, 5 boys went to explore a cave in West Virginia. The cave was called Killiansburg Cave. Brian Quintanilla was 13 years old. He was curious and liked to explore. While the other boys stayed in the main part of the cave, Brian found a narrow passage. The passage was very tight. It was only as wide as his shoulders. Brian thought it might be a secret shortcut. He decided to crawl through it. The passage was shaped like the letter L with a sharp bend in the middle. Brian squeezed into the passage. The rocks pressed against his shoulders and hips. When he reached the bend, he had to twist his body in a painful way. He had to bend his knees backward to fit through. Brian pushed through the tight spot. At first, he felt happy that he made it, but then he realized something was very wrong. He was stuck. He could not move backward. The rocks held him tight like a trap. The other boys noticed Brian was missing. They called his name and looked everywhere. Finally, they heard his voice calling back. They found the passage where he was stuck. They could only see his legs sticking out. The boys tried to pull Brian out by his legs. Nothing worked. Brian was in a lot of pain. The scout leader was Brian's mother. She rushed to help her son. She crawled as close as she could to the passage. Brian's mother knew what they had to do. Brian would have to twist his body backward the same way he went in. It would hurt, but it was the only way to get him out. She grabbed his legs and told him to start moving. Brian screamed because it hurt so much. His skin scraped against the rocks. Every inch was painful. Inch by inch, Brian's mother pulled him out. It took a very long time. Finally, Brian's body came free from the tight spot. When Brian got outside, he collapsed on the grass. He was breathing hard. Brian's body got better in a few days.